Welcome to the One Advantage podcast, exploring the intersections of peer power, culture, and agility. Your hosts, Mike Richardson, Jason Richmond, and Leo Bottary, co-founders of the One Advantage community of practice and advantage peer groups. For more information, please visit us at the One Advantage podcast.
Hey, welcome everyone. Mike Richardson and Jason Richmond are on assignment today. We will say that. And we actually were supposed to have a guest this morning. And unfortunately, our guest wasn't able to join us kind of last minute. So which kind of puts us in a position where we have to eat our own dog food a bit, right? We have to be agile. So I thought it would be a really great opportunity to talk with you all today about why peer power is so important to culture and why it's so important to agility and why the three together create that one advantage. So very briefly, I spent probably 25 plus years in corporate communications, right? And one of the last jobs I had was actually at Vistage, kind of real job, if you will, right? And so I was there and I headed up brand communications while at the company. I was there between 2010 and late 2016. It was actually late 2012 when, private equity actually purchased the firm for the first time. And in 2013, I led a brand refresh of the company. And I'm going around the country and I'm talking with CEOs and I'm asking them, how do you learn? How do you grow? How do you bring new thinking into your organization? And they're telling me things like, well, I read books, I have a coach, I hire consultants, we go to events and conferences. Some suggested they went to executive development programs at places like Harvard and Stanford, but nobody, zero, suggested that being part of a peer advisory group was even in their consideration set. So I remember going to the board of directors at the time and just saying to them, in addition to reporting on the status of the rollout and all, I shared the experience of talking with CEOs. And I essentially said to them, look, Vistage has been at this since 1957. There's a whole lot of other organizations who've been doing this for quite some time. The bottom line is we're trying to sell a Mercedes to someone who doesn't even know what a car is. And so basically what I suggested to them was, let's kind of step back and look at this entire category, not to write a hardcover brochure about Vistage and how great we are and all that, but why don't we actually look at what everybody's doing? Look at how and why these peer advisory groups that are run all over the world are so incredibly powerful and so incredibly effective. So someone at least could have a narrative that they could reference, which would explain this value proposition in a way where they could think, is this right for me? So that's essentially where the power of peers came from. It was published in 2016. It was co-authored with Leon Shapiro, who at the time was the CEO of Vistage. And since then, I wrote 2 other books. I'm just really providing this as a little background, little context for what we're going to talk about today. The second book was actually called What Anyone Can Do. And this was kind of a fun project because it was the result of some work that basically involved my first foray into podcasting, and it was called The Year of the Peer in 2017. The reason I called it The Year of the Peer was I thought, might as well have an exit strategy in the event that I'm not, into podcasting so much. But obviously, it was a lot of fun. I like it, and I continue to do it today. I actually interviewed 50 guests that were incredibly successful, and they were amazing people. And I asked every one of them, did you become successful all by yourself? And of course, they laughed at that notion. They're like, of course not. There's countless people that have helped me. And not only will they never able to pay them back, but it also provides them, I think, the real impetus to pay it forward, to others who are looking to, advance their careers and figure out what they want to do with their lives. But one of the things that became evident and where the title, What Anyone Can Do, of that book came from, is a book written by Joe Henderson back in 1976 called The Long Run Solution. And when he was talking about really successful runners and just successful people in general, he said, what's interesting is you look at these people, they're not capable of leaping tall buildings in a single bound. They don't have superhuman strength and talent necessarily. He said, in most cases, they just do the things that anyone can do that most of us never will. So the premise of What Anyone Can Do is, if you can enlist and engage the support of others, which we really don't do nearly often enough, they will help us do those things that anyone can do. And, so with that, kind of writing that book and kind of parallel to that, I had developed a workshop from the first book that I started delivering for CEO peer advisory groups and for eventually company teams. To this day now, I've conducted probably, when you consider all the organizations I've worked with, somewhere around 400 workshops for groups and teams, where we have intentional conversations using some of the frameworks originally developed at the Power of Peers, but they've advanced quite a bit since that time, as you might imagine, because you're constantly learning, every time you're in front of a new group or team. And with these intentional conversations comes amazing solutions, if you will, that come directly from the people in those conversations. And once they own those solutions, they become, a critical part of making them successful. So when I think about all this work, I also think about the fact that our peers in the workplace are so unbelievably powerful. And oftentimes what I do to kind of illustrate this point is I share a story of my daughter, Taylor, when she was in preschool. And I'll usually show a photo of her, right? And remind people, of course, that this is not a recent photo of Taylor. Taylor's 32 years old today. But back when she was 4.5, I picked her up from childcare one night. It was Halloween, 5:30. I walk in the door. I said, "Is Taylor ready to go home?" And the woman at the front desk says, "Just a second, the director would like to have a word with you." And I'm like, "Oh, excellent," right? Because if you've ever picked up your kid from childcare and the director wants to have a word with you at the end of the day, it's never great. But in this case, however, the director came out. She's got this big smile on her face. She said, "I've got to tell you what happened today." She said, "It was amazing. We had this party for the kids and this crafts and treats and music, and they're all sitting around. And we thought it would be a fun idea to have this woman dress up as a witch and come and entertain the little ones." Well, sure enough, the witch comes in, and I guess to be kind about it, she was maybe a little too authentic for some of the preschoolers, right? So a kid starts to cry. Second, third, fourth, boom, it spreads like wildfire across the room. Teachers are running around. They're trying to calm the kids down. Apparently, it's bedlam in here, right? Taylor sees all this. She runs to the front of the room. She makes herself real big. She says, "It's okay. She's not real. There's no need to be afraid." And the kids are looking at her and they're looking at one another and they say, "All right, whatever." And they collect themselves. They get back around the table. Party continues. The witch stays. And there we have it. So what was amazing about that is that, when you think about it, it's not like I ever sat my 4.5-year-old down and said, "Hey, if the kids in your classroom ever get upset, step up and be a leader," right? That was clearly all on her. By the same token, I'll often ask groups, what was it that caused all those kids to get so upset? And, essentially, they'll say fear or uncertainty or this and that. But usually there'll be at least one person who said, "I think it was that first kid. The first kid who started to cry triggered the second, triggers the third, spreads like wildfire, across the class," right? And all of a sudden, there you have it, right? By the same token, while I would say the kids would have eventually calmed down, right? It happened a little faster when one of their own said, "I think we're good here. I think we're okay." Now, what's kind of interesting about this is that what happens in Taylor's classroom, what happened that day, happens in people's companies all the time. And I'll usually talk about this to CEOs and I say, it happens very frequently. I said, minus the screaming and crying, I hope. And of course, many of the people in the room will say, "Oh no, we have that too. We got it." So the reality, of course, is that anytime you're at your company or announcing a new change initiative, a new policy, a new strategy, anything like that, it's not as if people just go back to their desk or wherever their place of work is and just kind of absorb it and that's it. They engage one another in sense-making exercises. They look to their colleagues, to their fellow employees to say, "Hey, is this good for us, bad for us? Is this okay? What's going on here?" And they engage in their own sense-making exercises, not a lot different from what happened in Taylor's classroom that day. And when you consider the whole swath of information out there, when you look at both failure rate and underperformance and you put them together, it's somewhere between 65 and 92% failure or underperformance rate for any change you want to bring forward in your company. But think about that for a moment, right? Especially when you start considering that more than 2/3 of the time, the reason that change fails has nothing to do with the fact that the change was so bad or the policy was so ill-conceived or anything like that. It's essentially because you couldn't get the people behind it to the degree necessary to make it work. And that's something to really think about in terms of our organizations. We see our companies as, our senior VPs, our VPs, our directors, managers, and all of that. And the reality is that it's what runs horizontally through our company that gives that vertical structure strength. People look to one another. And it's a very powerful aspect of things. So imagine now the next time you have a change initiative that you want to bring forward. Think about who are those key influencers? Because when I ask CEOs, hey, do you have people in your company who are really influential with other employees, even though they're not at the most senior levels in the company? And every hand in the room will be raised, right? I mean, they get that. They understand it. Now the question is, how do we get their input? How do we get some of their buy-in and some of that, so that when we are making an announcement, these key influencers can engage in those sense-making conversations with everyone else and really serve as ambassadors for what it is we're trying to do. Because I think when you have folks left to their own devices, they're going to reference their own experiences and their own history. I mean, how many times have companies, where you've got employees who say, yeah, there's this new change and everyone's fired up about it. But last year we had something just like this, a lot of fanfare. And then 60 days later, no one was talking about it anymore. So you start having to think about how we can inspire a level of trust and engagement in employees. And the more that you can help facilitate that among one another, the better. And by the way, just so we don't have to rely entirely on my daughter's Halloween story to make the point, time and time again, if you look at the incredible work of Edelman and Edelman Trust Barometer, right? Edelman, global communications firm, who's been running this study called the Edelman Trust Barometer since 2001. It's a study of public trust in institutions, government, business, media, and NGOs. They do it across 28 countries across the world, and the results are typically announced during the World Economic Forum at Davos every January. Each year, in addition to looking at trust and how that changes over time, right? As you might imagine, think about the 2008 financial crisis, right? In the years following that, trust in business was pretty low. Today, it actually enjoys a higher trust level than slightly higher than that of NGOs and non-governmental organizations. Who takes the hit on trust today? Media and government. But oftentimes they will, as they did in 2019, and they have very much so in 2022. But one of the things I want to reference is a question that they asked employees in 2019, which they basically said, what is your most kind of common source of workplace information? And interestingly enough, there's emails and announcements and every other platform you might be able to imagine, right, in terms of where people get their information. At top of the list? From other employees. They get it from one another. And the reason they get it from one another is they actually trust each other more. They trust each other more than the CEO, more than the directors, and certainly more than media and government officials, right? When there's any kind of an announcement made, when there's any kind of news to be shared, it's not necessarily a commentary of where they first heard the information, but it is where they find out what it means. And this becomes really essential to, again, getting the kind of an alignment engagement that is so necessary for people to do what they do. So when you think about what it means to start being intentional about gauging your peers, there's a few things that I think the research uncovered, if you will, when we first started looking at this back in 2016. So when we were looking at really high performing peer groups, now you're probably asking, what is even a high performing peer group? What does that look like? Well, in many respects, we actually relied on the organizations to share that information with us because they would measure it, but they would do it in different ways. Some might have used Net Promoter Score. Others were looking at compound annual growth rate of members over time. Others were using retention. Others were using just flat out satisfaction surveys over a whole number of areas. But regardless, what we identified was that every single high-performing peer group had what we referred to as a powerful and robust learning achieving cycle. Let me just share a little bit about what that is. If you think about a reinforcing loop that starts with learning, and what we know is that we learn better when we learn together. Social learning theory has been telling us this for decades, and there's mountains of research about it. And Josh Bersin actually did a terrific study which just paints such a simple picture of the dynamic involved here. When he talked about the fact that, let's say that you and I all read a blog post or a magazine article, and we read it one time. On average, we'll remember about 28% of that article for about 24 to 48 hours. And then and then it falls from there. If we read it twice, the number goes to 46%. However, if we all read the same article and decided to share experiences and grapple with the concepts, and speak to one another about what this looks like from our perspective, that number now goes to 69%. So think about that in terms of how people help you understand learning more deeply and what that looks like. The interesting part, of course, is it doesn't stop there. Because as you look at the learning achieving cycle, it's not just about learning and sharing, because you're not a book club. I mean, it's not as if you're just here to learn some things and then go away. What groups also do, and what teams also do really well also, is they help one another by giving each other that confidence, that courage, and that encouragement to try things that they've learned, right? To apply them. And once they apply them, even if there's some trial and error in there, all of a sudden now they will celebrate that result, which is an important part of what's been added to the learning achieving cycle recently. And I'll talk a little bit about this later, is this whole idea of celebrating. I originally thought about it as just part of that achieving stage, but the reality is that so few people celebrate that I think it becomes really, really important to be intentional about it and to call it out very specifically, because now we celebrate. It gives us that fire. It gives us that fuel to begin, right? Learning, sharing, applying, achieving, and celebrating more, because we love to celebrate. The reality is that I don't care where you are. I've yet to meet a company who would suggest, or the leaders would suggest, that they celebrate enough. Many of them do, and they do it, and they recognize it, but they recognize that they could do it more, and how powerful that really is. The other thing we noticed, of course, about group and team learning is that they experience what's called both intentional learning, right? We get certain content and we take in that content and we understand it and maybe we do something with it. But we also experience collateral learning when we're part of a group or team. And that's what you learn from how you learn. So when you're engaging one another, think about it. You have to be present. You have to be locked in. You have to be a good listener. You have to try to be open. Listen to new thinking and ideas without jumping to conclusions, making assumptions, or rendering judgment on things. The more you build muscles around those particular things, it will not only make you, in the case of being in a group, a better member of the group, but you will leave that group and actually be a better leader in your organization and model those behaviors in your organization in a very powerful way. So this starts to become, again, you start seeing the power of peers now, right? You start seeing the power of how we model for others and what that looks like, and how we can think of our organizations and our peers not as people who drag us down or just hold us at bay, but who lift us up and who get us excited and inspired about what we do. I want you, I guess, to think for a moment about the very best team that you have ever been part of and what that looks like. I mean, think about it. I've talked to CEOs about this all the time, and they'll reference everything from Little League baseball and Pop Warner, or being in the high school band, or things like that, right up to teams that they may participate in today. And in every case, it's all the same kind of attributes, right? Largely, by the way, about how the members of the team were truly in it for one another. Right? There's that camaraderie, there's that bonding, there's that trust that team members have with one another that's rather remarkable. And I think it's something that we want to really think about, is how do we go about being intentional about inspiring that, accelerating that trust with our team members. And this is where we identified the fact that, great learning achieving cycle, great that there's intentional and collateral learning, but there's also a recognition that this doesn't happen by accident, right? This doesn't happen by just putting a bunch of people in a room and hoping for the best. So this is where we came up with a 5-factor framework, again, that we've modified, but still, used today in facilitating intentional conversations about team members so they can do look at one of these 5 areas, right? Starting with the right people. Do we have all the right people in the room? Do we have all the right people on this team? And if so, what do we expect of ourselves and what do we expect of one another? And let's really put that down and identify what those values and behaviors are. And using that, quite frankly, as a foundation for a purpose statement. Why are we here? What are we here to do together? And be really clear and be really specific about that. Second is, you can have a lot of great people and great players and all that, but if they don't enjoy psychological safety, if they don't, feel a sense of belonging, if they can't admit mistakes, ask questions, contribute ideas, challenge the process, or even challenge the leader for the good of the purpose of the organization, right? Then you've hired these people and now you've got them in a box. Now you're really not unlocking all of that incredible intellectual and emotional capital that you have in front of you. So having them enjoy psychological safety, which of course, as you know, is the work of Amy Edmondson at Harvard Business School. It was really put, made as part of our business lexicon when Google, identified it in Project Aristotle, which, by the way, the researchers there will admit that they thought whoever has the best people win. Like whoever has the right people, whoever has the best people is going to have the best team. Of course, you don't have to look far. You can look at sports as a great example of how many times have we seen a more talented team lose to a less talented team, right? It's not just all about talent. It's about how do we unlock that talent and how do we get those folks working together, which is where productivity plays into the third factor that we talk about. And I think today, when we consider, writing the next chapter of the future of work, when we're working hybrid, when we're doing all of these kinds of things today that, are very different from what the world looked like pre-2020. How do we be productive together? What does that look like? And while there are a lot of leaders who are really reticent to, invite that conversation because they, in a lot of ways, would love to just have people back at the office. By the same token, you're getting a lot of pushback on that. People, I think, have proven that they can be productive outside of the office. They can build relationships. They can do great things. So I try to think about this conversation about productivity as one that kind of relies on this, I think, terrific quote from Thomas Jefferson, where he said, in matters of principle, stand like a rock. In matters of style, swim with the current. And I think leaders who engage their employees with that kind of mindset. So here's where we're not going to compromise. We have standards of excellence. We have values. We have things that are really crucial to this company that we have to make sure that we not only maintain, but we, continue to improve upon over time. By the same token, how we go about doing those very things can be subject of some really rich conversation about what a productivity looks like and how can we engage one another in a way that helps us deliver on those values, on those important tenets that are critical to our company. Next, we look at culture of accountability, and not the culture of accountability that makes people feel like they're playing defense, right? I mean, it's really much more a culture of accountability where people can engage one another in a manner where they accept personal responsibility for bringing their best because they know everyone else will do the same. I had the privilege of being part of a team at MullenLowe. I was there for a brief time, quite frankly, because I was kind of later in my career and I kind of had taken one agency gig, too many, quite frankly. And I was only there for about a year or so. But, upon reflection, I realized what an incredibly great gift that was to me to experience being part of a team that was so amazing. And it was very much about that. People came to Mullen because they believed they could maximize their potential as a professional and where they believed they could be part of an ensemble that could create the best advertising in the world. And their commitment to doing that leads to oftentimes a lot of conflict and a lot of stuff going on there, which is why if you see their logo, it's an octopus with boxing gloves. But what you really learn when you're there is they're not fighting against one another. They're actually fighting for the best idea. And it's what makes that team so incredible. But the culture of accountability, I believe, is really quite remarkable and really kind of amazing. Last but not least is really looking at leadership, right? When we think about how important it is to have, a good leader on the team, a servant leader, a leader who's there to make the team successful, not to make them successful, a leader who sees themselves as a part of the team, not apart from it. And also a leader that serves as that steward of those other four factors, right? Because all of these things that I've talked about aren't like you just check off the box and you move on. They require constant attention, right? We want to make sure we've got those right people with those right behaviors, that they not only have an environment of psychological safety, but they're actually leveraging it to everyone's advantage. that they are productive, that they have that healthy culture of accountability to one another. And this is where, again, you start seeing the power of peers and how incredibly powerful it can be. And these are the kinds of things that when we're working together and we have that level of what my friend Craig Weber, who wrote a wonderful book called Conversational Capacity, talks about, it's that balance between candor and curiosity, and that understanding about why we're here and that commitment to purpose. That being said, I actually want to close out on this because I mentioned I would share a little bit about celebration because it was added to the learning achieving cycle. And when I think about peers and people working together and enjoying being with one another, one of the great things that you get to do is celebrate. I mentioned about being at Mullen Lowe, and I actually used the same practice when I owned my own agency years ago before selling it. And that is, oftentimes we would do a pitch, for a new client. And if anyone's ever done this before, it's an unbelievable amount of work, and the presentations are lengthy, and it's just so much that goes into it. And quite frankly, sometimes you win the business and sometimes you don't. And sometimes when you don't win the business, it doesn't have anything to do with the quality of what you presented. So one of the keys, I think, is to make sure that you don't lose the opportunity to celebrate the work. And what I mean by that is every time, whether we were at Mullen Lowe or when I had my own agency, once the presentation was done, before we ever found out what the decision of the client was, we would go out and celebrate that effort. We would celebrate the high quality of work that we all did together and make sure that we, enjoyed that moment. What's the worst thing that's going to happen? You find out you win the business, you have to celebrate twice, right? Isn't that, a rough deal? But by the same token, if you find out you didn't win the business, nobody's in the mood to celebrate. You've now lost that opportunity. I also think about this as, in terms of a couple of different metaphors. If you're looking for some ideas about how to identify opportunities to celebrate. One of them is, years ago, I took my daughters to climb their first mountain peak in Colorado. And we're there and they're all excited. We get above the tree line and we're doing our thing. And next thing you know, you start looking at that peak. And if you've ever done this, you'll be climbing and you climb again and you climb. And every time you look up at the peak, it never seems to be getting any closer. It starts to become really physically and emotionally demanding. So we get to a point where one of my daughters says, "Hey, Dad, I think the view's looking pretty good from here." And another one was worried, and they're like, "Oh, Dad, this is a white puff of cloud up near the peak. Is that is that any weather we need to be worried about?" And I said, "No, I think we're fine." Well, next thing you know, they're like, "Okay, Dad, time out. I think this has been great, but I think we're just a little bit exhausted here and maybe ready to get down." And I said, "Tell you what, if you could give me 15 more minutes." And so sure enough, they say, "Okay," and they agree. They climbed the 15 minutes. Now, before we left, there was this bush coming out of a rock. And I said to them, "Hey, let's just note where we are." And they weren't really sure about why I was doing that. But of course, we climb our 15 minutes. Of course, 15 minutes to the second. They're like, "All right, we hit our 15 minutes. I think we're done. Look, that peak is no closer than it was 15 minutes ago." I said, "Look behind you." And they looked behind them. And all of a sudden, there was that bush that looked like a tiniest dot on the landscape. And they were amazed at how far they had come. They're like, "Wow, did we make incredible progress?" Next thing you know, they're climbing for another 10, another 15, measuring their progress along the way, celebrating that win. And before you know it, they make it to the peak that day. They summited. And they couldn't have been more proud of what they did. And to this day, as leaders in their companies, they recognize the value and power of that and about celebrating and what that can mean. So oftentimes we get so focused on the goal that we oftentimes just don't always appreciate how far we've come. And I think there's that and other ways, to think about celebrating. I actually wrote a piece in CEO World I invite you to take a look at, where I talk about different ways to kind of think about when and how to be celebrating. So, here we are as we're getting close to the end here. And first of all, I'd love to celebrate you. I'd love to celebrate, Jason and Mike and Brian and everyone that's involved with putting on this podcast. We work together. We, rely on the power of peers ourselves to do everything we can to try to bring content that we think is valuable and helpful to you all. And we're just excited to be able to do it. To learn more about The One Advantage, you go to theoneadvantage.com. You can also find us in anywhere that you typically listen to your podcasts. And again, we're just grateful for you as our listeners. And until next time, we will see you soon. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks for listening to the One Advantage podcast. If you liked this episode, please consider helping us by rating us wherever you listen, spreading the word, having us as a guest on your podcast or webinar, and mentioning us in social media. Find us at the One Advantage podcast, where you can get more information about us and this episode. Thanks again for listening, and we look forward to more great episodes to come.